Okay, ready to start. So hi everyone, my name is Haya Atassi. I am the head of the Media Relations Department at Syrian Association for Citizens' Dignity, which is a civil rights grassroots popular movement established by citizens from different regions of Syria to serve the people of Syria. The association has absolutely no political affiliation. It works to promote, protect, and secure the rights of the Syrian refugees and IDPs, whatever they are. Thank you everybody for attending. Thank you very much, Sarah and Richard, for being with us today. I will introduce you a bit later. But first, let's talk about Idlib. Idlib is an area in northwestern Syria which houses almost 4 million people who have been displaced from several areas in Syria, whether it's Hama, Aleppo, Halab, Homs, and elsewhere. They were displaced through a mechanism of systematic and strategic displacement by the Syrian regime and its ally Russia, and it now resembles one vast and huge displacement camp in one area. But it's very important to mention that as we speak right now, the current situation in the camps in Idlib is disastrous and atrocious, and the displaced people on the border are yet to face another harsh winter in open air. Only a few days ago, we had 17 housing units that were destroyed under heavy rains in the Shuhada Tarmala camp in northern suburbs of Idlib. Not to mention the very bad infrastructure that has been destroyed in the area, and people and the hospitals ran out of beds to treat COVID-19 patients, including schools and hospitals and markets that have been destroyed. And people having to live through daily attacks by the regime and by its ally Russia. So very quickly, just to give you a very quick glimpse of the situation in Idlib. And just for perspective, the number of displaced people in Idlib amounts to more than the total number of displaced people during the war of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And since the most recent onslaught in Idlib in February 2019, more than 1 million people have been displaced to the border with Turkey, which is already an overpopulated area due to displacement from many other regions. This amounts to the greatest displacement in the Syrian war, and as well to the largest single instance of forced displacement that have been ever witnessed in the world. The Syrian regime and Russia's strategy was to instill terror and fear in the people for them to force them to flee their homes with systematic and direct targeting of the civilians. And thus no people would want to live under Assad rule in areas that Assad and his forces claims. And these people are currently living in makeshift camps with conditions that are below any dignified human level, and they are entirely aid dependent. And so Human Rights Watch recently published a report titled Targeting Life in Idlib, Syrian and Russian Strikes on Civilian Infrastructure, which documents what the organization assesses as war crimes that even amount to crimes against humanity by Russia and the Syrian regime with the aim of forced displacement. And this report examines the 11-month Syrian-Russian offensive of unlawful attacks on civilian and civilian infrastructure in Idlib, documenting 46 ground and air attacks, which come in violation of international humanitarian law and also laws of war. And this also builds on a report by Amnesty International in May 2020, which also documented 18 unlawful air and ground attacks by the Syrian regime and its allies. And to talk about this today, I have with me Sara, Kayyali, and Richard Weir, who are researchers from Human Rights Watch, to examine the implications of this report and its important findings, and to discuss how we can prevent the continuation of these crimes and how we can hold the perpetrators accountable for these violations. So thank you very much, Richard and Sarah, and thank you for Human Rights Watch for engaging with displaced Syrians and publishing such reports. Allow me to start with you, Richard, and if you can tell us more about the report, elaborate on the key findings of this report and their significance.
Sure, and thanks, Haya, for having me and for taking a close look at the report. This is something that we spent quite a bit of time researching. I think because of the magnitude and scale of the attacks and the displacement. And so, obviously, Human Rights Watch has done a lot of research and investigations into what's been happening in Syria, and this is only the latest in a long line of really extensive reporting. The purpose of this report was to also go beyond documenting some of the individual abuses of the laws of war that Syria and Russia are committing, and to examine the extent to which these attacks on schools, hospitals, and markets are actually part of an intrinsic military strategy. So to conduct this research, because we weren't able to access Idlib, we were denied permission to enter Idlib from Turkey. And also because of COVID-19, we were still able to interview 100 victims and witnesses of the attacks, spoke to military analysts and other experts. We examined dozens of satellite images and verified over 550 photographs and videos taken at the attack sites. These substantiated what witnesses had told us, and we cross-checked all of the information we gathered against flight spotter logs. As you mentioned, we've documented 46 unlawful ground and airstrikes carried out by the Syrian and Russian military alliance in Idlib from March 2019 to March 2020, which killed at least 224 civilians and wounded at least 561 more and triggered mass displacement. These attacks, of course, only represent a fraction of the total number of attacks during that time in Idlib and in surrounding areas. Most of the strikes we documented occurred in 4 urban areas in Idlib: Ariha, Idlib City, Jisr al-Shugur, and Malata Numan. These attacks damaged 12 healthcare facilities and 10 schools, forcing these institutions to shut down, in some cases permanently. The attacks also destroyed and damaged 5 markets, 4 camps for displaced persons, 4 residential neighborhoods, 2 commercial areas, and other civilian infrastructure. The Russian and Syrian governments, of course, have claimed, as they have done in the past, that they're only targeting what they say are terrorists in Idlib and do not target civilians. Idlib governor, of course, is largely controlled by HTS, which, of course, as you know, the UN has designated as a terrorist group. The Syrian government in July 2019 sent a letter to the president of the UN Security Council that states that 114 healthcare facilities in Idlib had fallen under the control of terrorists at various times. It claimed the ambulance network was completely knocked out. It said that all healthcare facilities in the government were not working, but our research directly refutes that. And of course, the facilities that we investigated in these attacks were all working as healthcare facilities at that time and under civilian control. It's the same with the ambulance network. Our report and throughout our investigation establishes that the vast majority of the ambulance network was working during the time of the offensive and during the time of the attacks. Importantly, we did not identify any military targets in the direct vicinity of any of the 46 attacks, nor did we see evidence of military targets in any of the hundreds of photos or videos that we analyzed, which include satellite imagery taken from around the times of the attacks themselves. The Syrian and Russian alliance used widely banned cluster munitions in 5 of the attacks, all of which damaged schools. The repeated Syrian and Russian alliance attacks on civilian infrastructure and populated areas in which there was no apparent military objective suggests that these unlawful attacks were deliberate, and the repeated violations of the laws of war were apparent war crimes and may amount to crimes against humanity, including the crimes of extermination, forcible transfer, and other inhumane acts. The attacks also seriously impaired the rights of the population to health, education, and an adequate standard of living, including food, water, and housing. The attacks, as you know, largely stopped, or the offensive was largely stopped in March 2020 when the ceasefire was put in place. But by that time, the Syrian government had regained control of nearly half of the territory in and around Idlib, including hundreds of towns and villages that were largely or completely depopulated by residents who were forced to flee the offensive. Our research suggests that these attacks may be part of this broader strategy to target all aspects of civilian life in certain areas of Idlib and to force civilians to flee so that the Syrian army could walk into empty towns. Again, such a strategy may amount to crimes against humanity, including, as we've said a number of times here, the crime of forcible transfer. We also wanted to really focus on identifying who was most responsible for the violations to understand, and also to understand the nature of the Syrian and Russian alliance. And so one of the other very significant aspects of this report, in addition to trying to identify what this pattern of strikes meant and describing them as having likely amounting to crimes against humanity, which of course is something that we saw in the report from the COI in July, but also is to identify who was really responsible. And so we spent a lot of time analyzing media reports, analyzing government statements, analyzing social media, and trying to understand the nature of the Syrian and Russian alliance. And what we found was that, of course, since the intervention in 2015, Russia has been heavily involved in the war in Syria, primarily through air support, but also through the provision of training and the establishment of other aspects, other units, large units of the Syrian army. And this, of course, has a direct relationship to Idlib because the Russian army, of course, or the Russian military rather, continued to carry out attacks, including through close air support. They've acknowledged that their so-called military experts have been killed in and around the areas of the offensive, as late as February, or they acknowledged it in February in any case. And not only that, but senior Russian military officials, including Putin, were in Damascus on January 7th, receiving a briefing from Russia's top commander in Syria. And that briefing included top members of the Russian military, to include the head of their main operations directorate, which is headed in Moscow, as well as Bashar al-Assad and Ali Ayoub from the Syrian military. So that's just one example showing you how close the coordination is between the two militaries, but also how high up it goes. And so one of the things that we do here is identify 10 different individuals. We identify 10 different individuals who may be implicated in these violations as a matter of command responsibility, that they knew or should have known about these abuses and took no effective steps to stop them or punish those directly responsible. And so in total, they include the respective presidents, their ministers of defense, the commander of the Syrian air forces, the Russian chief of staff of the army, their head of the main operations directorate, and 3 Russian generals who led the Russian contingent of forces in Syria at different times between March 2019 and March 2020. We also look at the extent to which they bear responsibility for the facilitation, aiding and abetting of the attacks that we document in our report. And so one of the main things that we do in this report is identify these individuals, and in addition to sort of a host of recommendations that relate to doing more work in the UN General Assembly for cross-border aid, but one thing we really press hard on here, and I think is extremely important, is to call for accountability for those who are most responsible. And this includes trying to establish this through the UN General Assembly, given the paralysis in the UN Security Council, and also calling on states to use all available tools that they have, be it through exercising universal jurisdiction to prosecute individuals who are responsible, but also to use the tool of sanctions where they are able to do that. I think I will leave it at that, as I think that's sort of the big aspects of it. Around this sort of issue of the strategy, characterizing the crimes as likely amounting to crimes against humanity, and then identifying really specifically these individuals who we believe bear the main responsibility for these crimes, and calling for them to be held accountable.
Thank you, Richard. Just before I continue, I would like to mention to the participants that all questions are welcome. They can write them down in the chat, and by the end of the discussion, we will discuss them. So, Richard, the report clearly establishes that the Syrian regime and Russia used forced displacement as a war tactic. And the crimes and the violations are happening right now, even as we speak, with the recent attacks that you mentioned in Ariha. And even despite the fact that you documented names of Syrian and Russian officials who were either directly involved in these attacks or knew about them but gave no order. So it seems like the international community is giving a carte blanche to Russia, and they are so silent about these attacks, and they so silent about what's happening. Why is this so? Why are they silent? What can be done? And is there any chance to bring these people and hold them accountable and bring them to justice?
Yeah, this is an important question, and I think probably the most important question. And I think one thing that, part of our research we tried to do is also identify the extent to which other states, including in the UN Security Council and the Human Rights Council, are aware of what's happening in Idlib. And one of the striking things here is that the UN Security Council held 21 meetings on Idlib throughout the offensive. And you have a whole host of Western countries that talk specifically about the targeting of civilians and the targeting of civilian infrastructure, not just by Syria, but also Russia. This is something that is known by the international community. So, in a lot of cases, countries have clearly said they want accountability, and they know what's going on and that it's unacceptable and it must stop. But the real problem here is that either institutions designed to handle this are being hamstrung by Russian and China, and by vetoes in the UN Security Council by Russia and China, or there's just a general lack of, there has been thus far anyway, a lack of political will to take the kind of necessary action on Idlib that is needed to send a clear message to both the Syrian and Russian governments that what they're doing is not just unacceptable, but it erodes the very quality of civilian protection outlined in international humanitarian law, the most basic responsibility as part of the Geneva Conventions to ensure and protect the laws that demand that states take measures to protect civilians. And so, this is why we've focused on trying to make it as easy as possible for states to identify those who are most responsible for these violations and to take action. So we're actively engaged in trying to encourage states to essentially do what they've been saying throughout the offensive, to ask that the violations cease and that there be accountability. So, we call on states to use all of the available tools in order to do that, and to frankly, to meet their own obligations under international law. And I think so I think the most important thing here is to recognize it, which is unfortunately, something that has characterized the conflict in Syria, is that, action is the lack of action is a consequence of the lack of political will in many cases. It's not a lack of knowledge about what's going on. So I think we can all be encouraged by some of the recent advances in a variety of fora in courts, in various countries. But we all know that that's not enough. And frankly, specifically in Idlib, there hasn't been any accountability. And I know I'm going on quite long, but just to mention, of course, that some of the people who were responsible for Idlib, and I would say most of the people that we identified that were responsible for Idlib, still are in control of forces, be they Syrian or Russian, inside the country. And that's why it's imperative that states take steps now to impose consequences for what's been done. Otherwise, we're likely to see a resumption of the same sort of tactics and the same violations and crimes that we've documented in this report.
Richard, I have a question. So about, the recent attacks that are happening now in Idlib and the escalation of the attacks, where we can see a sign of another onslaught, okay? What do you think would be the impact of these renewed attacks on the civilian population there?
Well, if the attacks like we saw in the last offensive continue, I mean, you're talking about squeezing an already squeeze. I don't know the appropriate. It's hard to find the words to describe how much worse it could get for civilians in Idlib, having already been forced to flee on numerous occasions, because certainly new attacks of the character that we saw in Idlib would cause displacement again, likely, and a further deterioration in a situation where, as you said, at the beginning, and as we've described in this report, a whole host of institutions meant to provide safety and security for the civilian population, including hospitals and healthcare facilities, have been either seriously damaged and in some cases completely destroyed. So you have people fleeing. So if the offensive were to resume, you would have again people fleeing, bomb after bomb, and a pandemic, being squeezed into a pandemic, which is still raging. And so the situation really couldn't be more dire, and the need for action to try and stop another offensive through accountability measures, to try and deter another offensive, and which is really to try to deter more abuses. It's imperative that states do this. Otherwise, we could see, if we see another offensive that's characterized by the same abuses, we're just going to see greater civilian harm.
Thank you, Richard. I don't know if you have time to continue, or Sarah. Okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in here because there are a couple of additional factors that really make the situation in Idlib right now much more precarious. One is, as Rich mentioned, the coronavirus pandemic, which has put the existing health infrastructure in Idlib, which was already almost more than 50% destroyed, under further strain. The other thing is that since the March ceasefire, we have lost one of the two border crossings into Idlib, and with it, the humanitarian situation has deteriorated, and UN agencies and humanitarian organizations that are operating in the area do not have lesser capacity actually to respond to humanitarian needs on the ground. And if you take that coupled with the fact that we expect that the Syrian-Russian military alliance will continue using its brutal and unlawful tactics, and the fact that the rest of the world is distracted by the coronavirus pandemic, then this really spells a true catastrophe for Idlib.
Thank you, Sarah. Richard, I think, Richard?
Yeah.
Okay, I think you have to leave.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to leave you. But I hope that we've also been. I hope that it's been helpful to hear some of our perspective on the report. We're always happy. I'm very confident that in my absence, Sara will be able to answer all of the questions. But I would encourage those who haven't had the opportunity to read the report to do so. I know it's quite long, but we try to go into as much detail, both on the facts and on the recommendations, which we think will be important for protecting civilians in Idlib and preventing further catastrophe. But so with that, thank you very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about the report.
Thank you very much, Richard. Back to you, Sarah. So can you talk a bit about the role of the IIIM, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism? Can these cases against those officials, especially the names that were mentioned in the report, be prepared and handed over to jurisdiction in Europe in case these people left Russia or Syria? Can these people be actually and effectively brought to justice?
Yes, and that's really the hope from the report. I mean, the report lays out in detail the way that these individuals were involved. We've seen the IIIM build cases that have been used in different European jurisdictions, and we've seen several cases, including one against a high-level Syrian official, take off in European countries, primarily in Germany. So this kind of thing, I mean, the IIIM and universal jurisdiction cases in different European countries really provide an avenue for these individuals to be held accountable. And the best thing about it is that the documentation is already there, right? The evidence is already there. There are witnesses, not just Human Rights Watch, but other organizations have done excellent work in building portfolios around these individuals. And so I think our hope is that both the IIIM and the war crimes units of European countries can take these portfolios up and build something around it. And this is not something that we've actually seen yet. Most of the universal jurisdiction cases have really been focused on torture and mistreatment, but I think this is going to be the first of its kind.
Okay, Sarah.
Hi, can you hear me again?
Yeah, sorry about this. So you will not add reference, so, unfortunately, because of the hacking that's happening. So we were talking about the Netherlands initiative and merge other states initiative. Yeah, so the Netherlands initiative is actually, it's a very welcome step for a couple of reasons. One, because it's a new path and a creative path to accountability. We really haven't seen people address the crime of torture as a state policy, which hopefully the submission of the Netherlands under the UN Convention Against Torture will allow eventually the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, to assess the case based on a state policy that rather than the individual commission of the crime, so personal accountability. And that's a very important avenue of accountability that we really haven't tested before, but that is reminiscent of other creative initiatives, including the IIIM in terms of accountability. From Human Rights Watch's position, of course, I mean, I think other states should not only support the Netherlands in their attempt, but should also themselves look for avenues to hold perpetrators of violations accountable in the Syrian conflict. And again, I think what the recommendations in the report do is that we acknowledge that avenues like the International Criminal Court and avenues like the UN Security Council are on Syria effectively defunct due to the threat of veto. So there are other avenues for member states, even unilaterally, to ensure that there's accountability for these atrocities. So with regards to Russia, you know, Russia alongside the Syrian regime is the major driver of displacement in Syria. Yet it does have a seat on the table of negotiations. And ironically enough, despite all the ample evidence we have that Russia is engaging in war crimes and crimes against humanity and forcible displacement, we find the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs organizing an international conference in Damascus in the coming days with the aim of discussing the return of the very people it was responsible for displacing. First of all, how can Russia be allowed to make such decisions and to talk about and discuss the return of people? And we know that Russia was the guarantor of the so-called reconciliation agreements, which witnessed that the regime, despite all the Russian guarantees, did not live up to its promises. The people who returned back to the reconciliation were detained, and they were forcibly displaced. They were arbitrarily taken to forced conscription. And so Russia is not a trusted party in this. And what can organizations like yours and ours do to raise this issue in a more meaningful way?
I think there are a couple of things that we can do, and I agree with your assessment that both the conference that is being planned by Russia, in the process of being planned, as well as the so-called reconciliation agreements, have time and time again proven to be not just ineffective, but in direct contradiction to their stated aims. And Human Rights Watch and others have documented these arbitrary arrests, forced conscription, continued harassment of individuals who choose to stay behind in areas that are held by the government and who choose to sign these reconciliation agreements. So I think it's very clear that the promises that are being made of safe returns, of reconstruction, of reform are only words on paper, if even that. What can organizations like ours do? The first and foremost is documenting the violations that are happening in areas where reconciliation is happening and where Syrians are returning, making sure that that information reaches the international community, and making sure that other states within the international community do not take steps that could encourage return. And I think it's an important point that we often miss. I mean, Russia can organize these conferences, it can call for the return of Syrians, as can the Syrian government, but Syrians cannot be forced to return except by countries that are currently hosting them, right? So if X country doesn't deport them or decide that Syria is safe and refuse to renew asylum requests, then Syrians would never return, right? So a large part of the focus here is actually less on Russia and the Syrian government and more on the countries that are currently hosting Syrian refugees in order to ensure that the conditions in those countries do not force Syrians to return. And I think here we do see a contradiction in the different narratives that are provided by states, because on the one hand, they want accountability, they condemn atrocities. On the other, they have policies in place that are not necessarily welcoming of Syrian refugees and that often force Syrian refugees to return. So a lot of the pressure here has to happen on the international community as a whole.
Regarding the current status quo that is currently in Idlib, and I mean, we can sense the community might turn a blind eye to a Russian and a Syrian offensive on Idlib, even if it means more displacement and more killing of people. But at least, okay, this conflict, so this could maybe the start of people to return or of resolving the conflict, let's say, which is not correct. You know that an Assad victory in Idlib could mean more displacement, it could mean more killing to return, the Donbass regime enough to return back in its areas. And then this could have more long-term implications of people trying to flee to Europe, and this could even a political solution, because why would the regime want to provide any concessions if it has an absolute victory in Idlib? What's your take on this? How do you think this situation in Idlib should be solved? And I mean, do you agree with my current assessment of the situation?
I think the situation in Idlib is really very difficult, right? And the difficulty in the situation in Idlib lies in the stakes that are there. I mean, when you're talking about over 3 million civilians currently in Idlib governorate, most of whom had been displaced from other parts of the country, and who have very explicitly said, including Eastern Ghouta, including southern Syria, and they have said that they do not want to live under the Syrian government. It's not just the process by which the areas are going to be retaken that are problematic and that we know are going to be problematic, but it's also that once they're retaken, we know from other reconciled areas or areas that have been retaken by the Syrian government that the underlying causes of people being displaced, the underlying causes that led Syrians to flee in the first place haven't been resolved. I mean, the security services, the Syrian security services continue with their practices unabated. The humanitarian situation in government-held areas is disastrous, and in large part due to the government's own practices and policies and corruption. And there's simply, I mean, we know of people attempting to leave government-held Syria now, today, against all odds. So it's I mean, the situation on the ground in Syria should send a very clear message to the international community that's allowing Idlib governor to be retaken using the unlawful tactics that we've seen, and allowing for those practices to proliferate isn't really going to resolve the displacement crisis or the refugee crisis. It's actually going to exacerbate it. And that's a message that the international community should continue to hear again and again.
That's true. I mean, even in our latest reports, and you're aware of it, the RC report, we mentioned that the main driver of displacement is the Syrian regime, and the main cause of displacement is security. And then as long as there's no security, as long as people fear for their lives, as long as the main driver of displacement is still there, which is the Syrian regime, we can't speak of a safe return, and we cannot speak of a safe environment. And if we don't have the safe environment, we are scared of renewed cycles of violence continuously happening in Syria. I think we are ready to open.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something here. It's a very important point. When we talk about security, it's not just no more airstrikes, no more bombings. When we talk about security, it means being able to say that you're secure or protected from harassment, from detention, from being fleeced at the checkpoint, from the numerous insecure practices that are now being practiced in areas that have been retaken by the Syrian government, even where there are no bombings or shootings or those active hostility the way we see in Idlib.
That's true. I think we can open now the floor for questions. Sarah, are you ready? So I can take the first questions from Amir Kayyali. What is the underlying cause? So what is the underlying cause for the international community's indifference towards the suffering of people of Idlib? What role in this can be assigned to the relentless dehumanization of millions of people there as terrorists and Islamists, etc.?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Thank you for it. I think the international community's indifference to Idlib generally, and indifference, I don't mean that they don't condemn the acts there, but that there's very little concrete action that's being taken to protect civilians there. And you can attribute that indifference to a few things. One is that people are sort of fatigued and don't want the responsibility of an additional 3 million people. This is the way it's sort of formulated, like the costs of the protection are too high for them. The other is that, as you mentioned, the presence of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham there, the fact that it's actually affiliated or designated by the UN as a terrorist group means that it's very easy to paint Idlib with a broad brush as we don't want to deal with this. We don't want to deal with the presence of jihadis and terrorists. It's also given the Syrian-Russian military alliance a very good excuse to bomb Idlib. What needs to be made clear is that, and HRW doesn't really take a position on this, but it's the way that you deal with terrorist groups is you have to distinguish between civilians and terrorists. And there is enough evidence that there's a large number of civilians who are the first and foremost being harmed in Idlib. And there's very little that people can do to actually sort of undermine that understanding. So the idea that they're all terrorists is definitely present there, and it's a very convenient rhetorical excuse, but I don't really think that it's behind the indifference that the international community has. I think it's more that there's a lack of political will to take concrete action, unfortunately.
We can take one more question. How is it that we are not hearing more about the criminal conduct of the regime and Russian Idlib from the UN agencies, especially the UNHCR?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, organizations like the Commission of Inquiry and the OHCHR and OCHA in Idlib have really spoken out very strongly about this. Several UN agencies have not, either because they don't consider it within their mandate or because they tend to, which is something that we do find slightly problematic. They tend to describe the symptoms or the impact. So X number of people are displaced, X number of people are without food, without actually attributing to the root causes of why these people don't have access to food or why these people have been displaced. And that lack of attribution, is really, in a way, hampers accountability efforts, especially by agencies that are operating there and that know exactly what they're seeing.
Yeah. This is a long question. So the Netherlands has recently launched the initiative to take this regime to the ICJ. How does Human Rights Watch see this as a okay, how is it possible that we have such an initiative while at the same time we have decisions like that of Denmark to send people back to Damascus countryside to the jurisdiction of the same regime? It's very ironic what's happening in these two countries.
That's a very good question, and I think it perfectly encompasses also that sort of that double standard that we're seeing. So there's a very positive move towards greater accountability by countries across the world, but there's also significant domestic pressure that they're facing in terms of the situation with refugees. So it seems as though those two sort of narratives are working in parallel and completely unrelated. And that's why initially when I asked the question, I was emphasizing the fact that there should be less focus on the, especially in terms of returns, on the Syrian Russian military alliance and what they're doing, and more focus on these member states that, on the host states, refugee host states, that know exactly that the situation in Syria is not what it should be. And that goes to the point of how you define security. Security isn't no airstrikes or no bombs, right? Security is the ability to live in dignity in these countries. So the question should be, are you able to live in dignity in Damascus? Are you able to operate there freely without fear of forced conscription or detention or mistreatment or torture? And when the answer is no, then these areas should not be marked as safe.
Yes, I think this is it. We can ask one more last question. So and then we can end. Do the concepts of freedom and justice no longer mean anything to the West, or is this region a second class to them?
No, I mean, to be fair, I think the international community has focused on Syria significantly. I think there is much more to be done by the international community as a whole to protect Syrians, much more. And I think that we haven't seen that yet. But it's also, I would say that there is a sort of a focus, and I think this report contributes to it, on how do we get not just the West, but the international community as a whole to act for protecting Syrian civilians in concrete ways. It's a long road and it's exhausting, and I think the cost that's being paid by Syrian civilians is devastating. But we really can't give up.
That's true. Very rich discussion. We apologize for what happened, and just to end, it's very important to mention that appeasing to these dictators and to these rulers who are willing to kill large numbers of people it doesn't work. It only leads to more wars, and it only leads to more violence. And we are hoping that the international community at a certain point would take immediate action and effective action to, to hold these attacks and these violations against these civilians, and to start really working towards arriving at a political solution for Syria that guarantees the rights of displaced Syrians in a safe environment, and also importance accountability and the importance of bringing these perpetrators to justice. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thanks a lot to Human Rights Watch for writing these reports and for documenting these important, and I hope to say.
Thank you.